in this slightly surreal situation, the UN General Assembly happening a private sector forum in a virtual context for the first time in 75 years. I'm not sure what the signing founders would have made of this virtual communication, but we're bringing a whole range of voices hopefully into the conversation today. I'm very pleased to be joined by three women who have really written, I think as a man, I have to say, I think they've written the playbook on leadership, really. I mean, not just for women leadership, but men actually as well. And they've all had incredible journeys and still are. So I have three questions, and what I'm going to do is, to save time, I'll just, you've got the backgrounds on the three of them, on the details for the event, and I'll just briefly introduce them as we go to each of them in turn. I'm going to go to Dr. Maleeha Lodhi first, I have three questions for each of them, and then I'll go to Gina, Din, and then to Dame Inga, and then we'll go round robin again. And if any of you have comments as we go through, by all means, you raise them in response to what you're hearing. And I hope I'm all loud and clear. So I'm just going to begin by, Dr. Lodhi, it was actually, I think, just a few hours ago that the UN Secretary General said, and I quote, "Gender equality remains the single greatest human rights challenge worldwide." And in 1995, you'll remember it well, because I know at that time you were Pakistan's ambassador in Washington, when a certain Hillary Clinton made that journey from Washington to Beijing, and that very famous statement about human rights and gender rights and women's rights. And here we are, years after that, 2015, you were one of the people there with the 193 other signatories signing up to the Sustainable Development Goals in 2015, representing Pakistan as permanent representative. That was sort of another milestone. But here we are later, and what the UN has referred to in this moment of time as authentic, the need for, and I quote, authentic, courageous, and empathetic leadership. So what does that mean to you, Dr. Lodhi, from your perspective?
So thank you. What a distinguished panel. So it's wonderful to join all of you who have been trailblazers in your own fields. I think it's important, to speak about my own personal experience just for one sentence. When I was appointed as PR to the United Nations by my country, and I was presenting my credentials to the then UN Secretary General, I said, "Secretary General, I'm the first woman to represent my country at the UN. It took my country close to 70 years to send a woman. We get it right at the end, but it takes a bit of time." So on the empathetic leadership question, I think we have to understand the context in which this has been said. This is a time which is extremely unsettled in global affairs, where we see the rise of right-wing populism, which puts their country first before anything else. We see the exercise of unilateralism. We see the flouting of international norms, international law. So I think that's the context in which the call has been made for empathetic leadership. And I think, to me, what it means is that it's not based on a zero-sum view of the world or of whatever area that you are functioning in, that it's based on, if you like, enlightened self-interest. Of course, self-interest is what motivates nations as well as people. But I think to put compassion, care, and empathy for the other at the heart of our pursuits, whether those pursuits are diplomatic, they're economic, or they're making money, but it's to understand with compassion the needs of others and somehow factor those in what you do. So I'll hand you back to Arif.
No, thank you. Thank you very much for that. And I mean, that's a very clear articulation of the response. I mean, the need for that empathetic leadership, particularly now. Absolutely. And I mean, Gina, if I could turn to you next. I mean, Gina, Din, you were the founder of one of Africa's most successful and biggest PR and communications companies over a quarter of a century. Grew it, and indigenous, so sort of a local business, growing it to that global scale. And so you've obviously, that point around leadership, what does that mean to you when we talk about that? And is there a distinct, I think in Africa we have many models in other regions of the world, but we talked about authentic, courageous and empathetic leadership. What does that mean to you in your experience?
So for me, authentic leadership is based on trust. And just as Maleeha just said, it's never more important than now. And I think, where we talk about trust, it's where we can trust the individual to lead the organization in the right direction, and where I trust the team to deliver to the best of their ability. In the last few years, we've seen more and more organizations look to empathy when it comes to how to lead. Understanding what our teams are going through really helps our teams deliver for us in the long run. I guess all those terms are leaders that care, which is what Maleeha just said, that are high in emotional intelligence. Empathetic leaders tend to be more relational as opposed to transactional. And I think some of the issues that we're seeing in the world today is that, we're seeing leaders that are transactional as opposed to relational. We're looking for good listeners. Interestingly enough, women are born with the skills of an empathetic leader. However, even though those skills make us more effective leaders, quite often I see women try to suppress these natural innate qualities because we're trying to mold ourselves after traditional molds of leadership. And, for me, I'd really like to encourage women not to shy away from our natural gifts. The leaders we see in our organizations often create a picture in our mind of what we think leadership should look and feel like, when in fact the world is calling for what we as women can give in terms of authenticity and empathy. So I'll hand you back to Arif.
Thank you, Gina. Yes, I think again the point about empathy and wider points. Dame Inga, you came into an organization as the CEO of Lloyd's of London, insurance, the insurance market. Lloyd's of London, the first woman to be CEO in 330 years. And of course, the opportunity to look at that, leadership in different contexts. But what does it mean to you in terms of the journey you've had when the UN refers to the need for authentic, courageous and empathetic leadership?
Well, I couldn't agree more with the other speakers about the empathy side. And it's seen much more now as a modern leader's required attribute. Whereas in the old days, it seemed to be okay just to come in and be able to sort of dictate and be very autocratic. And when I arrived at Lloyd's and I looked at why Lloyd's hadn't managed to reinvent itself, it was very successful, but it was over 300 years old, and it was fundamentally doing business as it had done in the previous 300 years, and this wasn't going to be fit for the future. And I came in and I was asked to modernize it and digitalize it, and I looked at what my predecessors had done. I looked at what the previous leaders had done, and I talked to lots and lots and lots of people, and it seemed to me that the previous CEOs had just try to force through this modernization, force through this digital way of working. The people hadn't been included. They hadn't been listened to. There was no feeling that anyone was actually caring about them. It was just, there was a man, and they were all men, as you said. I was the first female CEO. There were these men on a mission to drive this modernization through, and it didn't work. So when I came in, I naturally had to be empathetic. But I also needed to show that courage. All leaders today, there's so much going on in the world. It's such complexity. And you need bold, courageous leaders to get out there and make the decisions that sometimes are tough. Sometimes they don't please everybody, but they need to be made for the future, for the next year, for the next 5 years. And in Lloyd's case, I hope for the next 300 years. So I had to make some tough decisions. And I think that courage shouldn't be, it shouldn't be overlooked, because it's a very important aspect of someone being a leader, because you have to make tough decisions sometimes. And the authentic side, that to me, again, I've seen so many women portray that just naturally. We don't mind showing a little bit of vulnerability. We don't mind saying, actually, we don't know all the answers. And if there's a real big decision to be made that troubles us, we'll say, this makes me anxious, and we're not worried about that. But providing you can show the confidence to the others, you're bringing them with you, you want to do the absolute right thing, showing that, that authentic side, that vulnerability actually can win you more loyalty and trust.
I mean, courage certainly, and I think there is certainly, we've had a number of crises over the years, but there has been obviously talk around leadership from women in a major crisis right now, and having a positive impact. I mean, Dr. Lodhi, if I can turn to you going round again, I mean, you were, and I hope you won't mind me saying, I mean, you were in, you were Pakistan's ambassador in New York at the time of 9/11. In Washington, my apologies, at the time of 9/11. You were Pakistan's High Commissioner, ambassador in the UK at the time of 7/7, the terrorist attacks. You were also there at the UN, at the time of the 2015, kind of a high point perhaps of multilateralism, when 193 countries, not 196, but 193 at least, all came together. But in the journey that you've had, in your own experience or your observation, I know the first time you were appointed was, I think, by Benazir Bhutto back in the early 90s, but then a career, over the period. In terms of your observation of women that have had to confront major crises and a challenge, are there any kind of key observations or experiences that you want to share?
Thank you. Arif, I think the one thing that I do wish to say, because we are meeting at a time when Inga is marking a historic milestone, I think the UN Secretary General, there are many things that he can do. He's done very well in enhancing the representation of women at the higher level at the UN. But I think women have a special gift as mediators, for all the reasons that I think the other panelists have also indicated. We are good listeners, we have empathy, it sort of comes naturally. We are mothers, many of us. So, there is a lot that we know how to nurture, whether it's a process we need to nurture or it's a child that we are bringing up, similar processes. So I think the one thing he needs to do is to ensure that there is greater representation of women in peacemaking processes. I'm afraid there aren't that many. Men are chosen because I think it is perceived that somehow in conflict situations, the men are, they're in danger zone. Well, if women are prepared to go out there, wherever the danger zones may be, and it's not as if the men are put in harm's way, mediators. So I think I would make that point. But in terms of my observation, I think you mentioned the late Benazir Bhutto, an extraordinary woman, the first elected prime minister of any Muslim country in the world. And I do think that on a couple of occasions, when I observed how she handled a couple of situations, I thought, it is gender that is helping her. And I'm one example I can cite, we were in a crisis in our relationship with the United States. We were under layers of sanctions, and fell to Benazir Bhutto with the administration of that time, and to be very much involved in this. And she was able to lead both countries towards a path of engagement rather than estrangement. So it took somebody like her. And another example, I think, is her handling of a relationship which has always been troubled between Pakistan and India. I think there too, she was able, at least on one occasion, I mean, the relations have always been turbulent, and they remain so even as I speak. But again, her ability to somehow, without compromising Pakistan's fundamental position, of course, that's the key. You preserve your position, but reach out in a manner that de-escalates tensions. Maybe you don't get to peace immediately. It's a long and laborious process. And then lastly, I would say, before I hand it back to you, Arif, I would say that in my own country, in Pakistan, I have seen women show leadership as women lawyers, taking up cases that no man would touch, on killings, rape victims, and a number of other areas which don't have to be, they're not necessarily gender related, but certainly gender-based crimes, women lawyers have shown the kind of leadership at great risk to their own lives, because these can become very deadly. Sometimes caught up in tribal, tribal revenge killings and so on. So I have seen that, and I think those are remarkably inspiring examples, and just shows what we can do much better. So back to you.
No, thank you. I know that one of the things that the Commonwealth, and this event has been brought to you, convened by the Commonwealth Businesswomen Network. I sit on their board. Is a Commonwealth Peace Mediators Network of women, and that's something the UK government, as chair in office, has been very keen to encourage and extend, very much for the reasons that you set out, and fascinating observations and experiences you shared. Could I go to you next, Gina? I've got one more question to get in after this, which is on the pandemic. I'm sure we'll get there. So just in a slightly shorter way, perhaps, if you and Inga could say, in terms of the same question, in terms of, you obviously work with clients across different sectors in different countries in your own journey as well. From what you've seen of women handling a crisis and a challenge where they've had a positive impact, is there something you want to say and share with us?
Sure. So in my own business, we've handled a lot of crisis communication, from a fatal airline crash to the dreadful effects of post-election violence in Kenya, and tragic effects from something Kenya has suffered of, quite often from, is terrorism attacks. And my team were largely women. A lot of my business growth came as a result of how we handled the crisis, various crises. We became the go-to company if there was a crisis. And what I found handling a number of crises was the greater involvement of women resulted in a greater perspective of the crisis, and paved the way for the deployment of richer and more complete solutions. So I do think a large part of our success was that we were mainly women on the team and had the ability to understand the pain of the situation, as well as the ability to communicate clearly and honestly, as well as Maleeha just said, as the ability to be vulnerable.
Yeah, but thank you. I mean, understanding the pain is a very powerful thing to say, and I think that's something that you certainly, again, very, very effective in how you describe that. Inga, can I just again turn to you with the same question? I know you've had in terms of the business world, there's been no shortage of challenges in the business world in terms of different economic cycles and having to deal with increasing regulatory requirements and all the rest of it. But in terms of where you've seen women leaders, of course, there are so few of them in the business world, relatively speaking, although it's changing. Even so, what would you say in terms of your observations of where women have had to confront a major crisis or a challenge with a positive impact?
Well, many years ago, I was running a company and we were in a crisis. And what I found as the CEO was the amount of communication I had to do. And I think Gina already mentioned about communication. It is so important when you're in a crisis that you communicate. And it's not necessarily that you know all the answers, but you just have to tell people what's going on and give them some comfort that at least you're doing something about it. So that was my real learning during my own crisis I had to manage. But if I think about a group of women, that theme that women like to work collectively and collaboratively for the good of all, I think back to the financial crisis and what happened in Iceland. Yeah. And that was the creation of a bunch of men. And it was a disaster for the country. And who stepped in to rescue the country and get it back on track? The women who were not necessarily leading the companies at the time, but the men moved away. The women stepped in and they took that country back and they gave it stability and gave it more different values, perhaps some female values, but values that people could trust and believe in, that they were doing the work for the people.
Yeah, I have to say, Inga, I mean, what comes to mind is Harriet Harman's very famous comment on the dispatch box, I think, was around during the global financial crisis, which I'm sure you'll remember, about the Salmon brothers being Salmon sisters, and perhaps in us not being in the same situation.
I think it was the Lehman. If the Lehman.
Oh, Lehman. Sorry, Lehman. My apologies. Yeah, sorry, I'm getting my investment banks mixed up, which is a cardinal sin if you're an investment banker, or even if you're not. So my apologies to all the people that may be offended. But you're right, Lehman sisters, I think it was the analogy. So there's been a lot of talk in the pandemic, which of course, is where we're in right now. We don't know, I'm speaking to you from a country that thought had got through the worst of it, from the UK, and I think it's probably not that case. It's still very uncertain, the contours of recovery. But I think one of the things that there has been very, very clear during this crisis, and I say this as a man, I say this as someone, that has been looking at this quite closely in relation to what the Commonwealth has been doing. And the Commonwealth Businesswomen's Network, which is recognised by all the member governments, we had the opportunity to join just a few days ago the first meeting of Women's Affairs Ministers that took place from the 54 Commonwealth countries. We were there as an observer. It was a virtual meeting. And in the discussions that took place, it was said, and I quote, the Commonwealth said, there has been a notable dearth of women's needs and perspectives in relation to COVID-19. Now, we can think of people like Jacinda Ardern from New Zealand, Mia Mottley, the Prime Minister of Barbados, maybe a handful of others, but there's clearly been a lot of talk around the lack of women's voices, even in terms of the press conferences, whether they're in capitals in the West or elsewhere, the lack of women's voices being there. If they are there, they're pushed at the back, et cetera, et cetera. So my question to the three of you, and I'll start with you, Maleeha, and I know that I know you're back in Pakistan now, but you've traveled a bit during this period. Why do you think that is? Why is it that there is this, in this period when we're looking for answers, we're looking to understand the context? Well, we know that women, in terms of healthcare workers, whatever country you're in, they make up the majority. We think about the impact on girls and education in schools, and of course schools, with so many people still out of school. Why do you think it is that there's that notable dearth of women's voices? But actually, and this is the clincher question, which I'll close on, how can that be addressed?
I think, Arif, thank you for that question. I think you're right to emphasize, and there's quite a bit that's been written about it, that amongst the world leaders who've done well in managing the crisis, of course, it can't be the only factor, but one of the factors has been women leaders at the helm. So you mentioned a number of women leaders. Of course, the New Zealand Prime Minister really became a star in this period for the kind of, empathy, grace under pressure, but above all, the sense of, being able to relate to how people felt. So really empathy, we're back to your first question, actually. Empathetic leadership. So, but of course, you're absolutely right to underline that women's voices have been absent. I mean, I find it shocking, because I think even for WHO, the World Health Organization, I don't want to sound like a certain president who has made sure that his countries were drawn from WHO and continues to criticize WHO. I don't want to sound like him, but I do think that WHO also, I never saw them design health information or healthcare for COVID specifically, which targeted women, in the sense that women could have led the health awareness campaigns that were needed, for example. I mean, the fact that there weren't enough women in some of these pressers that you're talking about, I think that speaks to something else. That speaks to the fact that, governance in both the West and the East tends to still remain, with some exceptions, notable exceptions, very male dominated. I mean, not everybody is like the Canadian Prime Minister, who makes enough women out there. So I think, part of it is something else, which is being kind of played out during COVID as well. So it's not unusual. But what struck me was how important mothers were and female members of a family were in the kind of precautions that are still needed, actually, because we're certainly not out of the pandemic yet. And I didn't see, I mean, apart from the fact that you didn't see many women amongst the policy-making crowd that you referred to, women were not sort of used as agents of, spreading the kind of health information that was needed. That is stunning. And I think a lesson that we should learn from it, which is what the last bit of your question is that, we need to be more aware and focused on doing that, because that'll help everyone. If you engage women, if you involve women, and you use women leaders, they may not be running their country, but they're running lots of other things. But nobody really made that effort, frankly. And that applies to both the West and the East, which I think is, it's unfortunate. In my own country, and I'll end on this note, my country's Prime Minister was very concerned about the impact on the poor, because they were not able to go and work. I mean, the rich still had, savings, so they could socially isolate and yet, remain in business, so to speak. So he used one of a very prominent woman in our country who then ran this or enhanced a program that was already there, which helped in terms of cash handouts to families, and those handouts were given to women, women members of the family that came forward. So I think there was an effort, at least in Pakistan, but clearly, we need to do better. Thank you.
Thank you, Maleeha. Gina.
So we've seen how women-led countries have suffered 5 times fewer confirmed COVID-19 deaths than countries led by men. I love the way, as we've said already, New Zealand's Prime Minister Jacinda Ardern helped coax the citizens of her country to buy into an extremely strict lockdown. I think her style of leading is the collaborative and democratic style of leadership we tend to see when it comes to women. As you've alluded to, we need to have more women in leadership roles, and I totally agree about WHO and the fact that we're not seeing more women in that organization. But I do also think that we need to ensure more women come out to vote. And in many countries, particularly on the African continent, who I represent, we see very few women, particularly between the ages of 18 to 35 at the polling booths. And I do believe we need to address that. And how do we make registration of voters, a lot safer for women, because a lot of them are very afraid to come out and register because of sexual harassment and rape and stuff like that. So I'm also very excited to see what happens at the WTO, the World Trade Organization, should one of the 3 women win that post. Kenya has a candidate, and we'll be rooting for her. It will be the first time in history that a woman is running that important organization. And as we talk about businesses, it'll be interesting to see if it is a woman, will they be able to restart the stalled talks, and what will leadership mean for the world trade, for world trade? Will trade for the world be about shared values around purpose and sustainability if there's a woman leading this important organization? And to end, finally, as the world mourns the death of the incredible US Supreme Court judge who just passed away, I think we could remember her simple conviction, which was that women belong in all places where decisions are being made.
Very, very well put. So just a couple of minutes, Inga, but over to you. What are your observations about the death of women in the pandemic?
Yeah, and of course it's true in so many aspects of life, and certainly true in business, that we just don't have that parity, that equality around the decision-making boards. And so we definitely need to keep pushing for it. And I think what's so tragic about this, the recent events, is that women are suffering more than the men. So more women are losing their jobs because of COVID, disproportionately. They're either having to take on the core burden of unpaid care work. So they're doing lots of unpaid care work. They're also working in those types of sectors that are most badly hit, such as hospitality, retail, manufacturing. So women, they didn't have their voice at the table at the beginning, and now they're having the biggest impact. And a lot of this is really just trying to get that, that gender equality, that gender parity through everything. And even in the UK, we still have a way to go in terms of getting at least financial equality. We know that there's a big gap between men and women in the UK on average. So it's still a fight that we need to keep fighting for right across the world.
Yeah, no, thank you very much. And although we've had some mention of the digital divide as well. I mean, that's clearly an area that's very important. I know, just to mention to Dame Inga, one of the things that Dame Inga was instrumental in is an initiative called Ensuring Women's Futures, which when you were at Lloyd's of London is a really interesting model, I think, of how an industry came around the issues around gender equality. So I just want to, we're at time, and I just want to close by thanking the 3 panelists that have joined us today. Dr. Maleeha Lodhi from Pakistan, Gina Din from Kenya, Dame Inga Beale from the United Kingdom. My name is Arif Zaman. This has been brought to you by the Commonwealth Businesswomen's Network. We've just joined the Target Gender Equality Coalition initiative of the United Nations Global Compact this week. And if you liked your last 30 minutes, do feel free to come back. This time tomorrow, we have a session, another session that we've also convened. It's being chaired by a special advisor to the World Health Organization that was mentioned earlier, Dr. General Tedros, and a panel focusing on health and education. But for the meantime, from here in London, I'd like to thank all of my panelists that have been with us today, and I hope you enjoy the rest of the week at this historic 75th UN General Assembly Week in UN Global